Every night, Gerald sat in his armchair long after the town had gone quiet. Outside, the porch light flickered gently, casting a golden hue across the aging wood floor. The air in the house was still, and the only sound came from the soft ticking of a clock that never rushed. At precisely 3:33 a.m., as if moved by muscle memory rather than thought, Gerald picked up the old landline phone and dialed a number he hadn't spoken to in years. The screen still showed the same 10 digits. The call connected. It rang once, twice, 3 times. He never waited beyond that. He would let it ring, then hang up, place the phone back down gently, and return to the silence. He had done this for years, not to hear a voice, and certainly not expecting one. The number belonged to Elias, his only son, the boy he had told to leave one bitter night when Elias came out. Gerald had said words no father should say. He had drawn a line that couldn't be crossed. And Elias had crossed it anyway, quietly, tearfully, with a suitcase in hand and no one behind him. The door closed that night with more than a click. It locked away a relationship neither of them knew how to fix. Gerald never sent a message after that. He didn't write. He didn't call during the day. He didn't ask about Elias. Even when neighbors hinted at updates or when church members asked how his boy was doing in the city, he just said, "We don't talk." And that was that. But he called. Every single night at the same time, because no matter how much pride had built walls between them, some part of him knew if Elias ever woke up in the dark and felt alone, the least Gerald could do was be the voice that reached across the silence. Even if it was never heard. The house hadn't changed much. Elias's room remained untouched. A thin layer of dust covered the desk where he once scribbled drawings. A book he had never finished still lay beside the bed. Gerald didn't go in often, but he kept the room clean, as if waiting for someone who would never knock. The old dog had passed. The garden Elias used to tend with his mother had grown wild. And yet, Gerald refused to move or change anything, because every small detail was a thread tying him to the boy he had driven away. The phone calls weren't dramatic. They weren't desperate. They were quiet, stubborn, and ritualistic. They were the way Gerald said, "I'm still here," without saying a word. A man raised to believe silence was strength had found his apology in repetition. He didn't know if the number still worked. He assumed Elias had changed it long ago, but he called anyway, because not calling felt like forgetting. And Gerald feared that more than the silence itself. One night, as he set the receiver down and stared into the darkness of the hallway, he whispered to no one, "If someone ever calls you in the middle of the night, it should be your father." Then he closed his eyes, leaned back into the chair, and let the silence hold him. If you've ever waited for words that never came, or longed to hear someone say they remember you, follow Heart Stories. Here, we believe every voice matters, even the ones in a small apartment hundreds of miles away. Elias stirred in bed without knowing why. The room was quiet, but something in the air felt heavy. His eyes blinked open to the glow of the digital clock, 3:32 a.m. 1 minute later, the old phone on the windowsill, an outdated model he hadn't used in years, lit up. It rang just once before he realized what it was. He sat up slowly. That number, that rhythm, that hour. It hadn't called in so long he thought it had stopped altogether. But there it was, glowing faintly in the dark, like a memory he never meant to keep. Elias had carried the phone with him across cities and phases of life, even after switching numbers, service plans, and phones. He told himself he only kept it for old photos, for contacts he hadn't transferred, or for nostalgia. But deep down, he knew. He kept it because some part of him wasn't ready to let go of the number his father used to call, even after everything. He hadn't spoken to Gerald since the night he left. He remembered every word of that evening, the storm outside, the trembling in his knees as he said, "Dad, I need to tell you something." The silence that followed, the flash of anger in Gerald's eyes, and the door that closed like a sentence without a second half. He had walked away with a suitcase and his heart clenched tight. No one had come after him. Years had passed. Elias had built a life of his own in Boston, one marked by quiet stability and a cautious heart. He shared an apartment with Noah, a friend who had once been something more, and who stayed long after the relationship faded. Noah had been there when Elias had nowhere else to go, had given him room to rebuild, and never asked for more than Elias could give. Elias rarely talked about his father. Not out of bitterness, but because the words felt too fragile, like a glass box he had learned not to touch. And now, at 3:33 a.m., the phone he hadn't powered on in months rang again. He stared at it, unsure whether to answer. What if it wasn't him? What if it was? What if he said nothing? What if it was the only chance he'd get? The ringing stopped. Elias's heart sank. He pressed the home button, staring at the screen as if it might rewind time. Then, a few seconds later, it rang again. He didn't think. He just answered. For a long moment, neither side said anything. All he could hear was the soft sound of breathing steady, quiet, and unmistakably familiar. It was the kind of breathing he remembered from long car rides, when they had nothing to talk about but still sat together in peace. The kind that said, "I'm here," without needing to speak. And then, finally, came the voice. "I still call," Gerald said slowly, almost like a confession. "I never expected you to answer. But I don't know. I just thought if someone ever calls you in the middle of the night, it should be your father." Elias said nothing. His throat was too tight to form words. He looked at the window, at the faint orange glow of the city beyond, and let the silence carry everything he couldn't say. Gerald didn't explain further. He didn't ask how Elias was, or where he lived, or if he was safe. He didn't mention what had happened all those years ago. He simply stayed on the line, breathing, waiting. For what? Elias wasn't sure. Maybe just to be heard. Maybe just to exist in the same moment. After a few minutes, the call ended. Not abruptly, just gently. Elias set the phone down, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't wake Noah. He didn't cry. He just sat in the stillness, heart full of 1,000 tangled threads. Regret, grief, hope, and something that felt a little like forgiveness. He didn't know what would come next. Whether it had been a one-time call or the start of something else, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost in his own past. For the first time, the silence between him and his father had been broken, not by an apology, but by presence, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin again. The drive back wasn't planned. Elias didn't pack a suitcase or tell Noah where he was going. He simply got in the car the following weekend and followed a road he hadn't seen in over a decade. The highway seemed narrower than he remembered. The trees taller, the town smaller. The closer he got, the more it felt like he was moving not through distance, but through time toward a version of himself he thought he'd buried. He hadn't spoken to his father since the call. No texts, no voicemails. But the silence felt different now. No longer thick with anger, but filled with questions. Elias didn't know what he was walking into. He didn't expect answers. He only wanted to see the place one more time, to know if what he felt in that voice at 3:33 a.m. had been real. The house looked the same, though the paint had faded and the porch sagged slightly at one end. The wind still moved through the trees in the same rhythm he remembered as a child, and the gate creaked with that same reluctant groan. But when he knocked, the door didn't open to his father. It was Simon. Elias blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't seen Simon since they were teenagers. Back then, Simon had lived just down the road. The kind of boy who always had dirt on his hands and a sketch pad under his arm. They had been close, so close it once scared them both. But life had pulled them in different directions, and time had worn that closeness thin. Now here he was, standing in the doorway of Elias's childhood home, as if he'd always belonged there. "Hey," Simon said, voice calm but cautious. "You came." Elias hesitated. "You live here?" "Not exactly, just staying for a while. Your dad's not well." He stepped aside, letting Elias in without further explanation. The house smelled of dust and lemon polish, and something in Elias's chest ached at how little had changed. His old shoes still sat in the corner by the door. The same mug he'd given his mother years ago still rested by the sink. Simon led him to the living room where Gerald sat propped up in his favorite chair, thinner than Elias remembered, his face marked by time but unmistakably his father's. He didn't rise when Elias entered. He only looked up, and for a long moment, they simply regarded one another, two men shaped by years of silence. Gerald didn't speak, neither did Elias. The room didn't ask for words. Later, Simon pulled Elias aside. He's been sick for a while, lungs. He wouldn't go to the hospital. Said he didn't need doctors to tell him what he already knew. I've been staying to help him manage. Just make things easier. Elias nodded, unsure how to respond. There was so much to say and no language to hold it all. He wandered into his old bedroom. Everything was still there. The posters on the wall, the books stacked beside the bed. Even the drawing Simon had once slipped into his notebook, folded with a quiet kind of courage. A boy holding a kite, a name scribbled beneath it. On the nightstand sat a dusty clock radio, and beside it, a small flip phone plugged into the wall. Elias picked it up. It was powered on. The screen showed a single call log, set to repeat at 3:33 a.m. He sat on the bed, overwhelmed. His father hadn't just been calling. He had programmed it. He had kept it going all these years, through sickness and solitude, through guilt he didn't know how to voice. Elias stayed the night, sleeping in his old room, listening to the familiar creaks of the house as if it were breathing around him. At 3:33 a.m., the phone lit up beside him. He watched it ring once, then twice before he answered. He didn't speak, neither did Gerald, but the line stayed open longer this time, and that was enough. In the morning, he found Simon in the backyard, cutting away overgrown vines near the fence. There was something quieter about him now, as if being here had softened edges that once stayed sharp. I didn't know you were close with my dad, Elias said. Simon paused, then gave a small smile. Yeah, we kept in touch. He didn't offer more, and Elias didn't push, but something in Simon's eyes told him this wasn't just kindness. There was history here, unspoken, patient, and perhaps waiting. As Elias stood there, watching the morning light stretch across the grass, he realized something simple but profound. The house had remembered him, even when he tried to forget it, and maybe, just maybe, the people inside had remembered too. The days that followed moved with a slow, careful rhythm. Elias didn't plan to stay, but he didn't leave either. Something about the quietness of the house, the familiarity of the creaking floorboards, and the unspoken routine between Simon and his father kept him grounded. Mornings began with black coffee, afternoons passed in the garden, where Elias pulled weeds in silence while Gerald sat near the window, watching without comment. Evenings were the softest, when the sun hit the living room just right and everyone settled into the comfort of being present without having to explain why. Gerald never brought up the past. He didn't say sorry. He didn't mention what had happened all those years ago, or what it meant that his son had finally returned. But he didn't need to. Elias saw it in the way the table was always set for 3, in the way Gerald kept glancing at the clock when Elias was late coming back from a walk. In the blanket folded neatly at the end of his bed, despite the summer heat, these were not grand gestures. They were small, quiet acknowledgments. And in a house that had once turned cold with words, the silence now felt warmer than anything Elias could have imagined. One evening, Elias found a letter tucked inside an old drawer in the hallway. It wasn't sealed, and the paper was creased at the corners. It began simply, "If you find this, I probably couldn't say it out loud." Gerald's handwriting was steady, deliberate. "You were never the problem. I was raised to believe a man had to be one thing. Straight-backed, strong-willed, silent. I didn't understand how someone could be proud of something the world told us to hide. I thought if I ignored it, it would go away. But when you left, all I could see was the shape of you in every empty space in this house. I started calling your number because I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't say I'm sorry. I didn't know how, so I rang the phone, hoping it would mean something, hoping that if there's a world after this one, you might forgive me there if I couldn't say it here. Simon found you last year. He didn't tell me at first. Just said you were alive, working, keeping to yourself. I asked him not to reach out right away. Not yet. I wasn't ready. I wanted to earn it. I asked him to stay, fix up the place, keep it warm just in case you ever came back. Reading it, Elias felt something shift inside. All this time, he had told himself that closure was a confrontation, a conversation, a demand for remorse. But what he held in his hands wasn't that. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough to undo the past, but it was real. It was effort. It was a man trying to show love in the only language he'd been taught through doing, not saying. That night, Elias didn't go to bed. Instead, he sat with Gerald in the living room, a soft blanket over both of them, the old TV humming in the background. They didn't talk much, but when Gerald's hand trembled, reaching for his cup, Elias reached over and held it steady. Gerald looked at him, tired, but clear-eyed, and nodded once, like he understood everything that wasn't being said. Simon came in later, setting a small plate of toast on the side table. He didn't interrupt, just smiled gently and returned to the kitchen. There was something in his presence, familiar, anchoring, a quiet closeness that had never really left, only paused. Around midnight, Gerald dozed off in his chair, his breathing soft and uneven. Elias stayed beside him, the letter still in his pocket. He watched the clock without fear or pressure. And when 3:33 a.m. came, the phone didn't ring. It sat quiet on the table. The ritual was over. Elias reached over and turned it off for the first time. He didn't need the call anymore. He was already here. In the morning, he stepped out into the yard to find Simon once again tending the overgrowth along the side fence. Elias walked over, watching him for a moment before speaking. "I read the letter," he said softly. Simon nodded without looking up. "He wrote that months ago, kept trying to make it better. I think he just didn't want to leave things broken." Elias didn't reply right away. The breeze moved through the trees, rustling the leaves with a low hush. "He said you found me," Elias added. This time, Simon looked up. There was something vulnerable in his expression, like a memory that had been waiting patiently to be acknowledged. "I didn't know if I had the right to say anything," Simon said. "I wasn't sure if you'd even remember." Elias met his gaze. "I did." No more words were needed. They stood there a moment longer, side by side, not as strangers or as boys from the past, but as men with the weight of years between them and something worth rediscovering ahead. The days grew slower after that. Gerald's strength faded gently, like a season easing into its final weeks. He no longer rose early or stayed up late. Meals became smaller, conversations even shorter. But there was peace in the air, as if a storm long ago had passed. And the house this weathered, stubborn house, was finally resting too. Elias stayed. Not because he felt obligated, but because he wanted to. Morning by morning, he learned the rhythm of the house again. He swept the porch like he used to, cooked the simple meals his mother once made, sat quietly with Simon in the evenings, sharing warm glances more than words. There was nothing dramatic about it, just life, unfolding without urgency, allowing itself to heal where it had been torn. Then one evening, a box arrived. It was unmarked, left by the front door, wrapped in old newspaper and bound with twine. Elias brought it inside and opened it on the kitchen table. Inside were dozens of small cassette tapes, each labeled by hand. Some had dates, others just said early morning, after the storm, or just in case. Next to them sat an old tape recorder. It still worked. He played the first tape. The audio cracked slightly. Then his father's voice came through, soft, slow, deliberate. "March 17th at 33 a.m. No answer. "That's all right. I just want you to know I saw your favorite soup in the store today. Still can't bring myself to buy it." The next tape played a similar message, then another. Some were longer, some were only a few seconds. All of them were Gerald, speaking into a recorder because he had no other way to reach his son. Not letters, not texts, just late-night messages to no one in particular, filled with quiet thoughts and things unsaid. It was Elias's life, captured through the lens of a father who never stopped watching from a distance. And in hearing it, Elias realized something almost unbearable. His father had been speaking for years. Elias just hadn't been listening. He played a tape marked final. Gerald's voice was tired. "I don't think I'll make another call. If you ever hear this, and if you ever come home, I want you to know, I knew who you were the whole time, and I was scared. Scared of the world. Scared of what it might do to you, but not of you. Never of you. Simon." Simon tried to tell me years ago. I didn't want to hear it, but he never stopped trying. He stayed, and he believed you'd come back long before I did. That night, Elias sat on the floor of his childhood bedroom, surrounded by voices from the past. Simon joined him, quietly lowering himself beside him. "He kept them all?" Simon asked. Elias nodded. "Every single one." There was a long pause, then Simon looked at him, more carefully than he had in years. "He told me something else," Simon said. "Before he got sick, he said, 'Petition, if you ever came back, and if I still cared, I should try again. But only if you asked.'" Elias didn't reply with words. He simply reached across the space between them and took Simon's hand. Nothing needed to be defined. Not yet. But there it was, the second voice on the line, the one that had been silent too long. And this time, it wasn't too late. Weeks later, after the funeral, Elias stood alone by the phone in the hallway, the same one Gerald had programmed for all those years. He pressed a button and let it ring once. Not because he expected someone to answer, but because, like his father, he understood that some calls are not about connection. They're about remembering. He returned to Boston soon after, bringing with him the box of tapes and a different version of himself, one no longer waiting for words that may never come, because he had finally heard them in his own way. Simon joined him not long after. And on some nights, just after the city quieted and the last train passed, Elias still looked at the clock at 3:33 a.m., not out of habit, but out of gratitude, for the silence that spoke, for the voices that stayed, for the love that waited. Have you ever realized someone had been loving you quietly, in ways you didn't notice until much later? Follow heart stories, because not all healing is loud. Sometimes, it's a whisper in the dark, waiting for someone to pick up.